2, and this week we're going to compare social and cultural entrepreneurship and focus a bit on the larger global dynamics of social entrepreneurship. Some scholars differentiate cultural entrepreneurship by indicating that cultural entrepreneurship is focused on reimagining social roles and motivating new behaviors, changing the way people think and act, whereas social entrepreneurship is using business practices to work on solutions for social problems, using business practices to make social change. Social entrepreneurship has a longer history. It's a term that's been in use for a while, although some would argue that it existed as a concept for quite some time now. The term cultural entrepreneurship is newer on the theoretical and historical scene. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about similarities and differences between cultural entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship and include some characteristics and cases. Then this week, we'll read and talk more about the two in a global context. Timmy Stupe-Alcala, in an article called The Intrinsic Value of Culture for Entrepreneurs, synthesizes some of the work of Cultura, an org that supports Filipino cultural entrepreneurs. Her article includes a version of the graphic you see on the screen. Stupe-Alcala argues that all entrepreneurs create use value and economic value, are innovative, seek and maximize profits, are alert to emergent opportunities, take advantage risks, engage in strategic thinking and organizing, are leaders, and are dedicated. Further, though, she notes that social entrepreneurs create social value through their work and are visionary in their orientation. They're catalysts for social change. To all of this, cultural entrepreneurs add explicit cultural value, which might be educational, symbolic, spiritual, social, communal, historic, political, and more. So we're going to break these distinctions down a bit further between social and cultural entrepreneurship and talk about social entrepreneurship first. Pravin Vise, a professor and entrepreneur, distinguishes social entrepreneurship from capital or business entrepreneurship. And he suggests social entrepreneurship focuses on trying to make the world a better place to live in, focusing more on the greater good, engaging in projects that may or may not generate traditional monetary value and income, investing a lot of time and energy in changing society, often with little in return, focusing on topics including the economy, social disorganization, and inequality, finding gaps and creating ventures to serve underserved markets. And in this context and in this work, profit, monetary profit, isn't the key driving motive or purpose. Social changes. And profit often isn't typically monetary wealth, but social environmental capital. The Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship offers a definition of social entrepreneurship, but more interestingly, I think they offer a list of characteristics. The Schwab Foundation claims that social entrepreneurs are people who achieve large-scale, systemic, and sustainable social change through a new invention, a different approach, a more rigorous application of known technologies or strategies, or a combination. One of the things, though, that I hope you take from this class and from the work we're doing is that not all change has to be large scale. Entre and intrapreneurs also engage in small, potent gestures that can have big ripple effects. But Schwab argues that social entrepreneurs aim for big change. They also focus on social and ecological value creation. Financial value is important, but it might not be the priority. They innovate by finding a new product, a new service, or a new approach to a social problem, and this resonates with Pravin Vise's description. And social entrepreneurs continuously refine and adapt their approaches in response to feedback. They're innovative, act sustainably, think constantly about reach, and aim for social impact above any other priority. And they combine the characteristics represented by Richard Branson and Mother Teresa. Richard Branson's key characteristics are that he's determined. If you've ever read a biography about him or seen an interview with him, you see that. He's passionate and engaged in what he does. He perseveres when problems arise. He has personality. He's extroverted, agreeable, conscientious, enthusiastic, and warm. He's flexible in his approaches. Mother Teresa is remembered and cherished as a person who was caring and selfless, strong, incisive, and persuasive, someone who spoke up for others, and was idealistic in nature but pragmatic in action. Someone who combines some of these traits and is often pointed to as an example of social entrepreneurship is Blake Mycoskie, the founder and chief shoe giver of Tom's. Mycoskie was stunned when he found out that many people lack shoes, basic protection for their feet. He met a woman who worked with a volunteer group that held shoe drives in the United States to collect and send shoes to people in need. Eventually, Mycoskie formed and built Tom's, which calls itself a one-for-one company. When you buy a product is donated to someone in need. In 2019, Tom's released a report on its 13 years in business and the impact that they've had. They've given 95 million pairs of shoes. Recognizing and realizing they were able to meet needs beyond footwear, they've contributed to more than 780,000 site restorations. They've provided more than 722,000 weeks of safe, clean water in communities that otherwise wouldn't have access. And they've maintained their commitment. For every $3 Tom's makes, they give away $1. That's more than 30% or 2/3 of their revenue to provide shoes, eye and vision care, safe water, and grants to support community projects. Tom's has expanded this work more recently into a COVID relief initiative and global giving fund, and we're going to read more about Blake Mycoskie's story next week. An example of a person that absolutely innovated the global social entrepreneurship landscape is Muhammad Yunus, and we'll read a chapter from his book this week. Yunus's work began in the 1970s when he realized poor people were completely restricted from the loans and financing that banks were offering, and that very small loans could make a huge impact on people's, especially women's, lives in developing countries. Yunus started microfinancing programs where small loans could make a huge difference for individuals. These aren't gifts or charitable donations, they're loans that are repaid. One of the really compelling arguments Yunus makes in the chapter we'll read is that when things fall apart, we can redesign, recast, and rebuild. We should not miss the opportunity to convert our financial institutions into inclusive institutions. Nobody should be refused access to financial services. Because these services are so vital for people's self-realization, credit should be given the status of a human right. And Grameen Bank is the microfinancing bank that Yunus created and that now serves more than 8 million borrowers, too poor for traditional banks to take them seriously. And Grameen Bank and Yunus recently won a Nobel Prize for this work. I would argue there's a difference between businesses who do some social good and businesses who have social good baked into their mission, vision, and business model. And Ben & Jerry's is an example of a business with social good at the core of what they do, along with making really yummy ice cream. Ben & Jerry's began when two guys took a $5 by-mail class on ice cream making from Penn State and got $12,000 in starter funds to open a shop in a gas station in Vermont. In 1985, the Ben & Jerry's Foundation was established, and the company allocated 7.5% of their annual pre-tax profits to fund community-focused projects. In 2002, Ben & Jerry's released One Sweet World, a flavor in partnership with SaveOurEnvironment.org. In the 2000s, they engaged in government action, environmental campaigns, fair trade initiatives, and more. In 2011, the founders of the company gave out ice cream in New York City in solidarity with protesters during Occupy Wall Street. In 2018, Ben & Jerry's created Pecan Resist to protest Trump administration policies, the containers for which featured artwork by Fabiana Rodriguez, an Oakland, California artist whose work focuses on social justice issues, including feminism, environmental justice, and immigrants' rights. She also runs Culture Strike, a collection of artists working towards social justice. In 2019, Ben & Jerry launched Justice Remix to promote criminal justice reform. Admittedly, Ben & Jerry's history isn't all goodness. In 2000, Ben & Jerry's became a subsidiary of Unilever. Unilever makes a lot of goods and products, including products with fantastically sexist ad campaigns like Axe body spray. One of their 2010 campaigns was Men with Braids, which implied that men who are friends with women are seen as women. The tagline was "Stop being a friend and start being a man," suggesting that if you're a man and you're not sleeping with the women around you, you're not really a man. That said, Unilever's history and practices haven't all been bad. In their global marketing, for instance, they've situated themselves as complementary to and not necessarily in direct competition with local businesses. Ben & Jerry's did something pretty unique in negotiating an agreement to preserve their social mission even as they became part of Unilever. They also negotiated to retain an independent board of directors, and on their website, the directors' bios look pretty different from typical board of directors listings, which often include the person's degree, what university they went to, what other businesses they're affiliated or associated with. On the Ben & Jerry's board of directors site, they include favorite music or book, a nonprofit or social environmental cause the person is associated with. Here, board member Darren Dodson notes his commitment to business justice, a term he coined to describe what I think is an extension of social justice, where business leaders embrace people's hearts, minds, and resources to achieve justice, peace, and freedom. I know of no other major company as transparent about its values, vision, and processes, or as activist in its nature. Imagine Ford, for instance, producing a car in resistance to President Trump's policies, or Mars Candy Company producing a flavor of M&Ms calling for prison reform and donating to that cause. Ben & Jerry's actually employs people as corporate activists. They hire people to engage in social change and action on behalf of and leveraging the company's resources. Ben & Jerry's has supported racial justice for a long time as a company, but gained a lot of attention last summer when they came out with perhaps the most powerful and pointed corporate written statement about the killing of George Floyd and our cultural context of white supremacy. The statement read in part, "What happened to George Floyd was not the result of a bad apple. It was the predictable consequence of a racist and prejudiced system and a culture that has treated black bodies as the enemy." And they didn't just call for an end to white supremacy, but suggested and engaged in direct anti-racist action. So Blake Mycoskie and Tom's, Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank, and Ben & Jerry's long-term social commitment are good examples to anchor social entrepreneurship. A more slippery concept is that of cultural entrepreneurship. There's a lot more research on social entrepreneurship than cultural entrepreneurship. I mentioned earlier, I think of cultural entrepreneurship as ways of leveraging arts and cultures to enhance an area or community economically. And I want to share 3 examples of such. First, recently, Sweden became the first country to adopt a typeface. Most countries, as an NPR story about Sweden noted, have a national flag, an anthem, a national bird. These things help to anchor the country's unique cultural identity. But more and more countries have turned toward the business practice of branding and used it to culturally brand their unique aspects and elements. This is a really interesting example of a business practice being put to work in terms of cultural entrepreneurship. And in this context, the entire culture or country is the entrepreneurial initiative. Most countries want to attract business, art, national recognition. Sweden has adopted a particularly smart branding strategy for anchoring its world identity. Along with a specific font face, Sweden has adopted a color scheme. And this color scheme and typography is for use on their websites, press releases, tourism brochures, and more. If Sweden succeeds when people see these colors together or they see this particular font, they should immediately think Sweden. Sweden will have culturally anchored their brand. Companies are pretty good at branding, but arts and cultural industries aren't often. Communities and cities can embrace their cultural industries to anchor their identity, and a great example of this is Grand Rapids, Michigan, world known for its renowned International Art Prize competition. And Grand Rapids has leveraged Art Prize to anchor its cultural identity. Art Prize is, as the organizers describe it, a radically open, independently organized international art competition and a 501c3 nonprofit org. For 19 days every fall, 3 square miles of downtown Grand Rapids become an open playing field where anyone can find a voice in the conversation about what art is and why it matters. There are exhibits throughout the entire city. The organizers continue. Art from around the world pops up in every inch of downtown Grand Rapids, over 160 venues, museums, galleries, bars, restaurants, theaters, hotels, public parks, lobbies, buildings, walls, bridges, laundromats, and auto body shops. And it's all free and open to the public. It's unorthodox, highly disruptive, and undeniably intriguing to the art world and the public alike. The 2017 winner of the $200,000 Jurors Grand Prize was Seitu Jones and his Heartside community meal. More than 250 people ate a meal together. And the purpose of the meal, as Jones described it, was threefold: First, to remind us of food rituals as absolutely inherently both culturally anchored but shared. We all eat, and what and how we eat is linked to our cultural experiences and backdrop. Second, food, Jones argued, exposes our differences and inequities, illuminates our similarities and connections, and builds bridges of understanding between us. And third, the meal is just part of the art experience. The people who participated engaged in discussions of healthy food access. Healthy food access is a particularly interesting social and cultural entrepreneurial challenge. Think about it. Most big good stores that offer a wide variety of reasonably priced healthy foods are out in the suburbs. You have to have a car to easily get there and stock up. In my neighborhood in South Lansing, there's a Kroger and it's partially walkable, but not if you're buying, say, a week's worth of groceries or groceries for a big family. And COVID has really changed access at the store. This time last year, I'd only seen flour on the shelves once over about 6 weeks. There were no fresh herbs, and the produce section was about 1/3 the size it used to be. Things have gotten better as the pandemic has gotten better. A lot of people near my neighborhood shop as best they can at Quality Dairy or one of the liquor stores in our neighborhood. You can get some basic canned goods and a loaf of bread, but you can't get kale or oranges at the Quickie Mart. The 2018 grand prize winner was The String Project by Chelsea Nix and Mariano Cortez, a husband-wife team of travel photographers. They traveled all over the world and invited people to hold a string. The goal of the project, as they described it, was to symbolize the invisible connection we all have to one another. The project is a reminder that highlights some of the most valuable things in life: respect, hope, peace, compassion, love, empathy, integrity, authentic and genuine interactions that humans crave. Art Prize will be held again this September 16th through October 3rd, an hour away from Lansing. It serves to anchor the city as a cultural capital, and it brings together hundreds of thousands of people around public art. It's a great example of a city and community engaged in cultural entrepreneurship. I want to head to Nebraska for one last example of cultural entrepreneurship. A couple of years ago, MSU invited back Andrew and Angie Norman. Andrew's an MSU alum, and together the two of them founded and run Hear Nebraska. Hear Nebraska is what I would consider to be a hybrid organization. It's a nonprofit, but it's one that leverages entrepreneurial ideas and work to make cultural change. So I'd argue it's a nonprofit engaged in cultural entrepreneurship. The vision of Hear Nebraska is to make the state a globally recognized cultural destination.
The Nebraska we see is full of life.
It's full of energy.
It's full of creativity.
It's full of passion.
It's full of hardworking people
Who want to close their eyes sometimes and connect with something greater than themselves.
Sometimes that comes in a church.
Sometimes it's in a field.
And sometimes it's amid a sweaty crowd, biting their lips, raising their fists to a musician.
who traveled from across the country
Across the world.
or across the street to perform original art at a Nebraska venue.
But what really gets us excited is the creative energy in the state.
It's the ability to surround oneself with brewers and chefs,
developers, designers,
songwriters and poets,
farmers and carpenters,
who are all driven to create something original, something uniquely them.
We produce events that bring together people across disciplines, races, ages, and sexes
to experience something new and always something surprising.
And we have our finger on the pulse of the young people who are deciding whether they should make a life somewhere else
or stay and make that life here.
We don't know what you see when you picture Nebraska,
but we know what we see.
At Hear Nebraska, we work our asses off to make sure the rest of the world sees it too.
Join us.
Hear Nebraska engages this mission by highlighting Nebraska artists, venues, and arts organizations. They run a Hear Nebraska radio site. They produce and promote music events across the state. For many of their music events, they bring in a famous Nebraska artist who performs with a local artist. They engage in both cultural and economic development. Two of their key activities are to help build a more positive, inclusive, creative cultural community and to document and preserve critical Nebraska cultural history, providing access to a wide audience. Cultural entrepreneurship is obviously culturally situated and framed, cultural entrepreneurship. But social entrepreneurship is always culturally situated and framed. Any social entrepreneurial project is engaged within an area, a community, a culture. Any social entrepreneurial project has to attend to the cultural and often global dynamics at play. Honestly, we could spend 7 weeks just starting to talk about cultural entrepreneurship and global dynamics, so we're just going to cover some fundamentals here. First, for week 2, we're going to read a groundbreaking article by Courtney Martin and Lisa Witter, in which they argue we need a richer, better understanding of social and cultural entrepreneurship. Then we're going to read a short chapter by Nancy Roof, where she describes growing global attention and awareness of enterprise in today's cultural context. Our next reading for week 2 is by Muhammad Yunus, who I just mentioned. We'll read a chapter of his called Social Business, From Dream to Reality. And our final reading for this week is a short piece about how social entrepreneurs innovated for social good during the pandemic. Our case for this week is the MSU Snares to Wares project. I think it's an exceptional example of both social and cultural entrepreneurship. We have one spark. It's a Sarah McLachlan video. It's fairly old, but it's for her song World on Fire. It's innovative in that rather than spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, producing a high-end music video, McLachlan, her husband at the time, and a graphic designer created a piece using the funding to inform us about how they made decisions instead and how they decided to otherwise spend the money. This week, as we consider cultural entrepreneurship and the larger global context, we're going to continue working on Project 1. If you haven't started developing content for and designing your website, you're behind. Review the assignment carefully, take a look at the examples linked from D2L, and get started. I'm going to send out and post this week my grading rubric for Project 1, so you'll have a sense of what I'm looking for. This should help you finalize and edit and polish your work before you turn it in this Sunday, July 18th by noon Eastern, and you're going to submit your work on D2L, a Word doc that includes your name and the URL to your website. If you have any questions about this week's work or about Project 1 before you turn it in, feel free to text or to email me.